The Pacific sun beat down with a relentless, blinding fury, cutting through the thin salt haze that hovered just above the rolling crests of the ocean. For days, the vast expanses of the Central Sea had played host to an eerie, suffocating silence, a vacuum where two naval empires lay out their invisible webs, waiting for the first tripwire to snap. But this was not the history the world memorized. This was an alternate convergence, a distorted rip in the fabric of global conflict where the iron dice of war rolled in a completely different direction. In this reality, the German Kriegsmarine had not abandoned its carrier program to the scraps of a shifting land war. The unfinished hull of Germany's only true aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, had not been left to rust in a Baltic backwater, fueled by a desperate, high-stakes gamble to break the Atlantic blockade and slice open a secondary front. The German Naval Command had pushed the vessel to completion, refined her air wing, and dispatched her on a long, hazardous voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to link up with their Axis allies in the theater of the rising sun. And now, gliding through the deep blue wastes of the Pacific, the predatory silhouette of the Graf Zeppelin was hunting. Miles to the east, cutting a clean white wake through the dark water, moved the supreme embodiment of American industrial might, the USS Midway. She was a titan born of lessons learned in blood at Coral Sea and the original Midways of the past, a massive armored deck fleet carrier engineered to withstand the heaviest ordnance the enemy could hurl. Her flight deck was a sprawling city of steel, alive with the deafening roar of turning propellers, the sharp, pungent reek of high-octane aviation fuel, and the frantic, precise choreography of hundreds of sailors in brightly colored jerseys. The Midway represented the apex of Allied carrier evolution, a fortress built not just to launch strikes, but to survive the catastrophic counterstrokes of modern naval warfare. Between these two floating airfields lay hundreds of miles of empty, treacherous ocean, a neutral arena where the old world's engineering would lock horns with the new world's industrial supremacy in a duel that history never wrote. The first move in this lethal chess match belonged to the scouts. From the catapults of the Graf Zeppelin, the sleek, specialized variants of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the rugged Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, modified with heavy tailhooks and folding wings, tore into the morning sky. The German pilots, trained in the gray, turbulent environments of the North Sea, looked out over a flat, deceptively calm Pacific horizon. They were looking for an American shadow, a radar signature, a break in the endless blue. Simultaneously, the Midway launched its own eyes into the sky, long-range Helldivers and Corsairs fanning out in a massive arc, their crews scanning the water with binoculars and fine-tuning their early surface search radar sets. The air was thick with tension, every wireless operator clutching their headphones, waiting for the sudden burst of static that meant contact. It was a lone American scout who cracked the silence first, spotting a faint smattering of black smoke on the distant western horizon. The pilot dipped his wing, diving through a layer of scattered clouds to confirm the impossible. Below him lay a massive, single-funnel carrier flanked by a lean, heavily armed escort of German destroyers and cruisers. The message flashed back to the Midway in rapid, rhythmic bursts of Morse code, giving the coordinates, speed, and heading of the German task force. Within minutes, the general quarters alarm on the Midway began its rhythmic, frantic iron clanging. The calm choreography on the flight deck instantly shifted into a high-intensity scramble. Armorers hoisted heavy general-purpose bombs and sleek, lethal torpedoes beneath the bellies of the waiting aircraft, their hands slick with sweat and grease. Mechanics gave the final thumbs-up as the powerful radial engines coughed into life, spitting blue exhaust into the sea breeze. The Americans knew that in a carrier duel, the one who landed the first heavy blow almost always walked away the victor. But the Germans were not blind. The Graf Zeppelin's advanced search radar, an experimental array mounted high upon her massive island superstructure, had picked up the American scout before it had even cleared the area. The German air commander did not hesitate. He ordered the immediate launch of his primary strike force. The flight deck of the Graf Zeppelin became a chaotic symphony of screaming engines, as the Ju-87 Stukas, loaded with heavy armor-piercing bombs, roared down the wooden deck, catching the wind and lifting into the sky. Alongside them flew the navalized Messerschmitts, their sleek lines cutting through the air like silver blades. The German pilots knew they were outmatched in sheer numbers, but they relied on their rigorous tactical discipline and the devastating precision of their dive-bombing techniques to balance the scales. The two strike packages passed each other in the high clouds, invisible to one another but locked on a collision course with destiny. The American Air Group, a dark, roaring cloud of corsairs, Avengers, and Helldivers pressed onward toward the German coordinates. As they approached the target area, the German task force opened fire with everything it had. The sky turned into a deadly garden of black flak bursts. The Graf Zeppelin's heavy dual-purpose 10.5 cm guns put up a terrifying wall of fire, coordinated by advanced optical directors that tracked the incoming American planes. With chilling accuracy, Hellcat and Corsair fighters dove out of the sun to strafe the German decks, trying to suppress the anti-aircraft fire, while the Avengers dropped low, skimming just feet above the Whitecaps to drop their torpedoes into the water. The water around the Graf Zeppelin erupted into massive geysers as heavy bombs exploded nearby, sending thousands of tons of salt water cascading over her flight deck. A flight of American Helldivers braved the intense flak, screaming down in near-vertical dives. The first bomb struck the forward section of the German carrier, tearing through the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar spaces. The explosion shook the massive ship from stem to stern, twisting steel girders and igniting a fierce fire among the spare parts and fuel lines. Yet, the Graf Zeppelin's unique internal compartmentalization and German damage control teams, trained to an absolute razor's edge, went to work instantly, flooding threatened magazines and fighting the flames with desperate ferocity. Even as smoke poured from her forward deck, she maintained her speed, her rudders swinging hard to evade the incoming wake of American torpedoes that missed her stern by a matter of mere yards. While the German carrier fought for survival, her own strike force was descending upon the USS Midway like a gathering storm. The American radar operators had tracked the incoming boogies from miles out, and the Midway's combat air patrol of F-4U Corsairs scrambled to intercept. A savage, swirling dogfight erupted in the skies above the American task force. The agile Messerschmitts clashed directly with the powerful Corsairs, engines screaming and machine guns hammering as the two distinct philosophies of aviation design tore each other apart in the high blue. The German fighter pilots utilized their high-altitude performance to dive onto the American defensive screens, clearing a path for the lumbering Stukas. Despite heavy losses to the American fighters and the intense radar-directed anti-aircraft fire from the Midway's massive battery of 5-inch guns and dozens of Bofors mounts, the remaining German dive bombers pushed through. The Stukas began their infamous, terrifying vertical plunges. The shriek of their sirens, though muted by the roar of battle, seemed to echo in the minds of the American sailors below. The German pilots lined up their sights on the massive, sweeping deck of the Midway. The first two bombs missed, tearing into the sea and shaking the carrier with massive hydraulic shocks, but the third bomb, a heavy armor-piercing monster dropped by a veteran pilot, found its mark dead center. The impact was catastrophic, but this was where the Midway's revolutionary design changed the course of the battle. Unlike older American carriers with unarmored wooden decks, the Midway boasted a heavy, armored flight deck designed to detonate bombs on the surface, rather than allowing them to penetrate deep into the vitals of the ship. The German bomb detonated with a blinding flash and a concussive roar that killed dozens of deck crew and obliterated several parked aircraft. But the armored steel deck held. The explosion was directed upward and outward, blowing out the sides of the catwalks but leaving the underlying hangar deck relatively untouched. The fires were intense, fed by burning aviation fuel, but the Midway's advanced foam-throwing systems and massive rolling fire curtains isolated the damage within minutes. The sky began to clear of aircraft as the surviving planes, short on fuel and ammunition, broke off their engagements and limped back toward their respective motherships. The ocean between them was left littered with the burning wreckage of crashed planes and floating oil slicks, a grim testament to the intensity of the clash. On board both carriers, the scene was one of exhausted, desperate fury. On the Graf Zeppelin, engineers worked under a choking cloud of black smoke to patch the hole in the forward deck, trying to create enough usable space to recover their returning aircraft. The ship was listing slightly to port, but her engines were still turning at 28 knots, her captain refusing to slow down and become an easy target for a follow-up submarine attack. On the Midway, the armored deck was a scene of scorched, blackened ruin, but it was functional. Tractors bulldozed the burning, twisted remnants of destroyed aircraft over the side into the sea to clear the landing paths. The damage control teams had performed miracles, quenching the primary fires and reinforcing weakened structures below the deck. The carrier turned into the wind, her arresting wires tested and cleared, ready to bring her sons back home. As the battered American planes began to touch down, the air commanders were already looking at the charts, plotting the next strike. They knew the enemy was hurt, but they also knew the German carrier was still dangerous, still moving, and still possessed a sting. As the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, blood-red shadows across the Pacific, both forces realized that the battle was far from over. The first round had ended in a bloody, indecisive draw, the German carrier proving far more resilient than American intelligence had ever anticipated, and the American giant proving that its armored skin could survive the best precision strikes the Luftwaffe's naval branch could muster. The commanders of both sides knew that the coming night would bring a different kind of peril. A game of hide-and-seek where radar, stealth, and night fighting capabilities would decide who survived to see the next dawn. The Midway and the Graf Zeppelin, two proud titans of different empires, lay in wait in the darkening waters, their crews preparing for the final, decisive blow in a legendary war of shadows that history would never forget.